I supported the CARES Act. It was the nation's initial response to the new virus. We didn't know what it was. The CARES Act was our effort to respond and to help American families and American employees remain financially stable while we endured the impact of this unknown virus. So here we are into year 4 of 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and is very well falls upon this committee under Republican majority to begin conducting meaningful oversight into the massive fraud that was no doubt staged to take place when you start rolling out programs with trillions of dollars. Some estimates as high as $7 trillion, the total economic commitment from the United States of America. American treasure, $7 trillion. That's 7,000 billion. It's 140 billion per sovereign state. There's an average of 62 counties per state. That's over $2 billion per county. I would argue that Americans across the country in local and state government would say they'd have done much better if every county could have received $2.2 billion in the form of a block grant. Of course, there was going to be massive fraud with programs like this, but what we expected was not the absence of fraud. What Americans expected is the presence of accountability and criminal prosecution. And that's what that accountability is what this Republican-controlled oversight committee is going to deliver. We know fraud is not born in the mechanisms of man. Fraud is born in the heart of man. It's to be anticipated. The gentleman referred to certain trade-offs between urgency and processes that were put in place as these trillions of dollars were set to be dispersed. Well, may I say that we anticipated this, but some of us, in order for the most conservative of us to support a $2 trillion response to this unknown virus, we insisted that this money be made available through local banks and credit unions, and we pushed the SBA product out through, my recollection is about 4,500 lending institutions that had never handled SBA product before. We wanted and we insisted that regular Americans would be able to communicate directly with the bankers they knew to access this assistance. So we knew it was ripe for fraud, but we expected criminal investigations to take place, and we expected people to be put in jail. Accountability for criminal acts generally begins with a suspicion and a report at the local level of fraud, theft, forgery, identity theft, etc. That leads to an investigation, should lead to an arrest, should lead to prosecution, should lead to conviction and incarceration. May I say, America would be just fine had we witnessed that kind of accountability. But it has to be pushed out of congressional investigations. That hasn't happened for the last 3 years. It will happen now. Director Smith, sir, specifically regarding investigations, that it's understandable that the most massive cases will be prioritized, millions and millions of dollars. But according to my research, the vast amount of fraud that we have witnessed is primarily from smaller cases, and I've been advised that they've gone ignored. Can you speak to that, sir? What are we doing at the federal level to assist local and state investigators to go after these smaller cases?
Sir, as I mentioned before, we follow money, we follow evidence, and one of the things that I talked about in my opening was the Secret Service training state, local law enforcement professionals at our National Computer Forensics Institute. It's the ultimate teach a man to fish, if you will. We train thousands of state and local law enforcement professionals every year to be able to investigate cases locally. I was just down in the chairman's home state last week in Kentucky, talking to some of our cyber fraud task force partners, and they were actually briefing me on cases they were working at a local level that were focused on elder abuse and some pandemic-related fraud. So we are a federal law enforcement entity, but we do have a responsibility to help train, equip, and resource our local partners who help us in every aspect of our mission to be able to build their capacity locally.
Thank you for your response, Director. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Porter for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I have questions about unemployment insurance. Mr. Dodaro, could you read this headline for the room? Yeah. Could you hold your microphone on, sir?
I'm sorry. California's EDD unemployment system disaster, predictable fiasco.
Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, could you please, we're going to get everyone in on the fun. Mr. Horowitz, could you please read this headline?
There is no way I can read this headline
Okay,
because
I'll
I
read
didn't
it
bring
for
my
you.
glasses with me.
EDD's new software has thousands of defects, some critical. Mr. Smith, we'll see. Well, it's also an eye test in case you need to get a checkup. Can you read that for me, Mr. Smith?
It says the North Carolina Unemployment Agency is a broken system.
A broken system. North Carolina Unemployment Agency, a broken system. Mr. Horowitz, do these headlines seem familiar? Do they seem representative of the problems with unemployment system during the pandemic?
They do.
They do. Would it surprise you to know that all of these news stories are from 2013 and 2014, long before COVID-19 was a problem?
Not at all. This has been an issue that GAO has spoken about for decades, maybe. I'm not sure if it's that long, but certainly we have as IGs as well. The unemployment insurance system needs to be fixed.
I could not agree more. So let's talk about that and how we can fix it. What these headlines show, of course, is that, as you said, state unemployment agencies have long had problems getting help to people who need it and preventing our tax dollars from ending up in the wrong hands. When the pandemic first began, we needed to deliver relief quickly. But due to chronic underinvestment in technology and systems at states that administer programs, we saw the same problems with waste, fraud, and abuse that we've seen for decades under Democratic and Republican presidents in blue states and red states. Mr. Dodaro, I want to talk about the GAO's high-risk list. What is that?
A high-risk list was originally created to identify for the Congress and the administration areas across federal government that we believe were highly susceptible to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, or in need of broad-based transformation as it evolved.
Did GAO identify unemployment system UI as a high-risk program?
Yes.
When?
In 2022.
June of 2022. In June of 2022, the year before unemployment was added to the high-risk list, do you know what the rate was of overpayment for unemployment insurance?
It was, in 2021, it was 18.9%.
Great. And according to the Department of Labor, before you put it on the high-risk list, it was about 15%. In 2019, it was about 9.5%. In 2018, it was 12.1%. In fact, the overpayment rate has been over 10% for 14 of the last 18 years, according to the Department of Labor's OIG. When GAO announced that the unemployment system had been designated as high risk, you said, quote, GAO is concerned that many long-standing problems may go unaddressed. Do you remember saying that?
I believe so, yes.
Is that a little bit of an understatement at this point?
Well, you know, for many of those years, it was mostly state money that was collected. There really wasn't big federal investment in this until the pandemic broke, or perhaps earlier in some other emergency situation. So, but I thought the time obviously was right.
Yeah, what the OIG has said is the UI program has experienced some of the highest improper payment rates across the federal government. So my question is, why don't we fix this?
Well, I think it requires some leadership on the part of the Congress and the Labor Department. You know, like a lot of these programs that where the federal government's relying on the state and local governments, they give them a lot of discretion. And when times are good, unemployment's low, you know, they don't get a lot of attention until these problems come up.
So here's how I think about this. When someone has a dollar and they lose a dime of it, they think, shucks. But when someone has $100 and they lose $10, they're like a little angry. And it just keeps going up, and now we're in the billions and trillions. So I would love to have your continued pressure on the Department of Labor to use all of the funding that Congress provided in the American Rescue Plan to actually modernize UI, because I'm trying to add up where that $2 billion from the American Rescue Plan has gone, and it does not seem to have all been deployed and spent to improve these programs.
Yes, no, I agree. We're going to follow that $2 billion. Also, I was in the Senate testifying last March with Michael Horowitz and the IG from the Labor Department. He mentioned the money that was given states after the Great Recession to reform the programs, and he mentioned some of that money went unused.
No, it absolutely did. And Mr. Chair, if you'll indulge me for just 1 minute. Yeah. In California, after the American Recovery Act, they were given a $2 million grant to EDD to prevent fraud. And guess what? It worked. At the end of the grant program, California quit using the fraud detection program. Penny wise and pound foolish, because that exact fraud detection program would have prevented and